All right, so just a quick word for those of you who don't know us. Mark and I are the founders of QRx Partners. You'll see our branding all over the slides. We are a consultancy out of Minneapolis with a focus on small to medium med tech companies, and particularly those that are early stage. Between the two of us, I think we're over 60 years experience now in the med tech space. I have another 7 years on top of that in the computer products um, industry as well. Um, and Mark's a former Navy guy, so we've got some military experience here as well. But like I said, we're consultants today, and we do a lot of this helping our clients understand the ins and outs of the standards and the regulations, right? Not just the black and white, but what does it mean? Why do they say things like that? And that's kind of the gist of today's talk, to get very narrowly focused on one particular element and talk about some of the things that are, you know, misconceived, and that we see as companies making mistakes, which likely has an impact on their ability to have an effective CAPA system. So, without any further ado, let's start learning something. All right, so let's start always with the basics, right? What is VOE? And I'm going to intentionally not spell out the words in the acronym yet because that's part of the discussion here is what does the V actually mean? So let's just talk about it as VOE. But at its most basic, it's just confirmation that your actions that you've taken are producing the results that you needed them to produce. Okay, where that often falls out is people sometimes we do see this a lot, confuse that with verification of completion, which is, did I finish the action? That's great. You do have to do that. You have to, right? If you have a plan, you need to be able to demonstrate that you followed the plan and executed to it. But just because you took an action doesn't mean you got the right result coming out of that. And so VOE is that, all right, now, did you do anything good with all that effort? Is really what it comes down to there. So don't get those two confused. VOC, which is not voice of the customer in this context, but verification of completion versus VOE. The places that this comes from, it's pretty broad and consistent. Starting with the medical device regulations, 21 CFR Part 820, under the section for CAPA, it's right there. Verifying or validating the corrective and preventive action to ensure that such action is effective and does not adversely affect the finished device, right? Which would be an obvious concern in the med device space. If you go to 13485, that's the quality standard for medical devices. And I think we have some people today that are not med device. Don't worry, I'll be addressing you as well. But from the medical device side of things, corrective action, preventive action are listed as two separate areas, as they should be. And there they just refer to reviewing the effectiveness of the action taken. So they use a slightly different terminology, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. And for those of you outside the regulated space or the med device or pharma space, ISO 9001 has a very almost exact same wording, right? Under their section for nonconformity and corrective action, they don't use the term CAPA. It's review the effectiveness of any correction actions taken, right? So there's pretty consistent wording here, except in 820, where they've used the words verifying and validating. And for hopefully everybody who's in that space understands 820 is going to change next February. So that reference will go away because they're just going to point at 1345, which refers to it as reviewing the effectiveness. So words are important, right? There's your everyday language, and then there's the language of work and of the regulatory environment if you're a regulated business. But if you look up a definition for verification, whether that's dictionary.com or the Oxford Online or whatever, you get something like this: the process of establishing the truth or accuracy of something, substantiating it. Then, if you look at validation, you get like the act of confirming something is true or correct, producing the desired result. They pretty much sound the same, right? There's some obvious differences there, but technically they are essentially synonymous. And what's interesting is if you go to those online dictionaries, you look at verification and they say, oh, what are the synonyms for verification? Validation will be in the list. And likewise, if you go to validation and then pull up the synonym list, verification will be in the list. So in everyday language, they are essentially the same thing with some subtle differences. But according to the standards, and particularly in the regulatory environment, they're not considered synonymous. Um, and we'll talk about where some of the basis for that is, but usually the one that resonates most with people is if we talk about design verification versus design validation, right? We understand those are two very different actions, and that's the same concept that carries through the rest of these standards and regulations, right? When they have a concept, they don't suddenly change it from section to section. It is meant to be an underlying concept. And I think for those who may not be familiar with it, when we talk about design verification, we're typically talking about actions taken to confirm that we did what we said we were going to do. And validation, design validation is, well, does it do anything good? Does it do what the customer needs, right? Does it match the requirements of the market and our customers, right? And those are two very different things. Did we do what we said we were going to do, but did it produce any value in doing it? Which is the same concept that carries forward into the CAPA process as well. And when we see the word review, obviously they're allowing for either one. VOE could be verification effectiveness. I prefer to call it validation effectiveness because I think really what's intended here is validation. Again, when you look at it, from a contextual perspective, you understand you've done your investigation at CAPA, you figured out your action plan, you follow that action plan. You, of course, want to confirm that you've finished that plan, and then you have to prove that that all worked. So to me, that last step, that VOE, is about validating that we got value, that we got the results out of those actions. So I would read it as review means, right, confirm the effectiveness, which is validation in our speaking.
And Steve, I just want to chime in here because
Mhm.
I think people, when you start using this V and V words, um, people then bring in all kinds of other things. So first of all, process validation is something different.
Yep.
Software validation is again something different. So don't get confused about this. What we're really talking about is providing some evidence, and this is where the term validation, right, comes in. You provide some evidence to have a high confidence level that what you did was effective, was correct. You can't never be 100%, but you have that high confidence level. And these are the things we're talking about from the documented information or the records that you provide, the testing that's been done, that you've validated that your action was effective. Okay.
Yep, that's great. Um, just quick to make sure we're engaging everybody here. I probably should have put a poll in here, but I just want to see you can use the thumbs up annotation. Does what I talked about there and what Mark just mentioned about the differences between verification and validation and continuing that concept in the CAPA, um, does that make sense? Is it what you've seen before? You have a similar understanding. I see a couple of thumbs going up. All right, good. Because I don't want to be baffling everybody here with this stuff. Um, and Mark, if I could put the words back in your mouth, I think what you sort of were saying on the side there was don't get too wrapped up in the words. And I think that's why the word review is being used in the standards, is just the concept is make sure you can prove that this gave you some value, right? So just review that. Whether you want to think of that as verification or validation is almost irrelevant. Just make sure that you have this step in there. And then the next part I'm going to talk about is, so when do you prepare for that? So some common misconceptions, that we see, I've alluded to some already. It starts with everybody correctly views it as an activity, right, that has to occur after you implement actions, right? That just makes sense. You're not going to be able to confirm that it worked and gave you any value until you actually do the work. All right, that part we get correct. And that's kind of how it shows up in the standards. The problem is, I think, is then that looks, because it's called out as a separate requirement in the standards and the regs, I think too often people interpret that as it's its own entity. It's this separate part of the overall process, and therefore we don't touch it until we get there. And that's not really the intent at all, right? But the problem then is it leads to a perception that VOE is not part of the rest of the CAPA process. It's something you do at the end, essentially. And that's not really what's intended at all. Like everything else, it's a process, and you have to understand everything that's going to go on in the process and make sure it is part of the planning up front so that you are prepared for it and ready for it. And I'm going to talk about some other value you get by doing it a lot earlier in the process than doing it after you've already executed your entire plan and gotten that far through the process. So, some of the basis for this. When we went through elementary school, we all got taught the scientific method, right, in some basic form. And then, as all of us became, I'm sure most of the people on the call are engineers or scientists. Obviously, we got the more formalized version of that. But when you look at the CAPA process and you think about things like the investigation phase and the identification of the actions you're going to take, you're basically forming hypotheses at that point. And then we know from the scientific method, the fourth step after doing that development of your hypotheses is to test them. You don't just forge forward and go, oh, I'm so smart, I figured it all out, right? It says, well, prove it. Figure it out how you're going to test this before you commit to forging forward with a plan and resources and all that other stuff and get your hopes up and then realize you headed down the wrong path. So I think there's a basis just in basic scientific method. But again, I go back to the design controls portions of the standards and the regs. If we look at, again, the 820 medical device CGMPs, in the section for design controls, and particularly in the section for design outputs, it tells you, right, that the definition of the design, it needs to include the acceptance criteria. You need to say, well, how will I prove that this design I've come up with delivers on the performance that I intended to, right? You have to be able to put it in measurable terms. 1345, same thing under design outputs, same requirement. You have to contain or reference the acceptance criteria. 9001, same thing under design outputs, right? So they're all very consistent in this expectation that, when you're creating a design, you aren't done unless you've decided, how am I going to measure the performance of this design, right? What is it going to make it acceptable at the end of the day? And then in a more practical thing, use the example, right? If you were asked to, approve or review a test protocol, you would expect that that protocol includes, what are the endpoints we're trying to achieve here? What is it we're trying to understand, and where do we expect this to go? If it didn't have that, you would I know I would push it back and go, I'm sorry, I don't understand. What are you trying to find out here? And so that's the concept here. So I don't know. Is there anybody who would accept a test protocol with no measurements? I doubt it, right? We'd all expect that, unless it was just pure research, right? And we don't know what we're trying to find, and here's how we're going to go experiment. Right? If it's an experimental protocol, that's different. But typically, when we're testing things, right, we want to know what's the end goal here. And that's what they're looking for in VOE. So again, how can you come up with your corrective actions, right? Or any part of your action plan, whether that's containment actions, corrections, corrective actions, preventive actions. How can you know you've defined them well if you don't know how you're going to measure them at the end of the day? Just pausing, see any questions so far? Anybody want to provide any feedback, share a story?
Steve, I'll go alongside you here for a
Yeah,
second
yeah,
because there's another place that we often talk about verification of effectiveness, um, or confirmation of the controls that have been placed, and that's in risk management. And so if you figure that, you're going to go alongside this, and when you do risk management, which really all of those things that you just said are correction, corrective action, preventive action, containment, all of those are risk management. You're keeping the problems from going outside and so forth. You're going to have to make these checks that the actions that you're taking are effective in doing it. Um, and so that's what we're, really focused on all of these things, with, taking that action. Did we actually achieve what we intended to achieve? So,
Yeah, and I get, one, it's the same kind of concept, and it just shows that continuum of the concepts, right? That they don't change from section to section of the, or even from standard to standard, right? If you're doing, med device risk management, then you've got 14971. If you're doing general risk management, you've got ISO 31000. But the concepts stay the same here, right? You have to plan everything, right? You don't plan part of it, execute, and then come up with a completely different plan for the later stages. Right? You want to make sure that you've got this good opportunity to succeed, right, and achieve your objectives. And if you don't think about what those objectives are up front, then your chances of achieving them go down considerably. All right, let's oops, I'm off.
I mean, Steve,
Yeah,
you
hi.
may have, I don't know if you're going to cover it later on, but I mean, some of the things we come across is the timing of that planning. So you have some timelines in terms of, the implementation, the investigation, implementation of the actions, but VOE could take several months after, and people, get nervous about CAPAs being open for that length of time. Have you got any opinions on that? And to,
Yeah, I
in terms
actually I'm going to cover that on the very last slide. Yep,
Yeah,
is
of, okay,
some of those
and
challenges.
Mark Wheeler had put in the chat too about how often were the rate of data points that you need for that verification of effectiveness, getting the data. And Steve will come back to it later in the thing. But again, we'll talk about those things. Uh, you know, keeping the CAPA open or
okay.
the amount of data that you need when that planning is due. I think that's what a lot of people get concerned about, and we'll try to address some of that here.
Yeah, so we'll talk about that because there are some of those other fears that then drive again this idea that, oh, I don't want to define this now until I understand it better. So yeah, all good points here. So again, let's just continue on this. So why is it valuable to do VOE earlier and just a general, right? So as I already talked about, right, it sets the targets and objectives, right? If you're going to expend resources, I think we all know CAPA, right? It's typically for bigger systemic, high risk kind of situations. And it takes a lot of, you know, resources. It distracts your organization. So I would think you'd want to know then, what is it we're trying to achieve here beyond just getting the work done? And, unfortunately, I have gone through audits and I can see that is sometimes the culture is just all right, we have a requirement to meet. Just what do we got to get done? Check it out, right? Checklist mentality. We got to get done. All right. And CAPA is not supposed to be that. It is supposed to be the way in which you keep your quality system effective, right? Is that we know no quality system is perfect. This is where you find out what needs to be perfected, or at least refined. And, we don't want to deal with it again. You don't want to keep fighting the same fire over and over again. So knowing what the target and what the objective or the objectives are just would seem to be of good business value, right? And just better for your use of time and resources. Um, it helps you determine, do you even have an understanding, right, of what you're trying to do? When you come up with an action, how do you know it's a decent action? If you just define an action and go ahead and do it without thinking about, well, how am I going to, measure this at the end? Right? How am I going to evaluate it? Then you don't really know that you've picked the right action or you've defined it well enough to be successful. So I always challenge if you're coming up with your action plan and you've got actions and you can't figure out how to measure them, it's probably not the right action. It's not a valid action, and therefore you're not likely to succeed. It could be an unnecessary action. It could just be an action that's not going to be very effective, or it could be you don't have enough actions defined. That happens a lot, or too many is another problem, right? You over plan, and now you're wasting a lot of resources to do four actions when actually only three of them would have gotten you to the goal, but you'd have to know what the goal is, right? And how would you measure that? And then evaluate the action plan against those goals and whether they're achievable. And then, before you get to your action plan, right, there is the investigation phase. And hopefully you do a thorough investigation. And that should include generating data, right, or information, because that's kind of your baseline, right? You can't get to point B if you don't know what point A is kind of the thinking there. And oftentimes VOE can simply be a repeat of what you did in the investigation. We did the investigation so we'd understand the problem. Now we understand on a measurable, quantifiable level, here's the problem we're facing. Now we can define actions. And at the end, let's take those same measurements and see if there's a difference in the data, right? We hopefully should see improved data. I just gave a very simple example here, right? Where we know we have a problem with there being too much scrap. We go into investigation and we decide, well, let's measure first pass yield. And it turns out that we only have a 70% first pass yield, which is pretty awful. Then right from that, we can figure out, well, what are we going to do to reduce scrap and improve our first pass yield? We execute that plan, and then we repeat the same measurements, and now we find out we're running at 99.999% first pass yield. We clearly have succeeded, right? The actions were clearly the right things. That could be part of how did we define the problem in the first place. We're not, right? The problem statement is we're not achieving a near 100% first pass yield. Oh, what are we achieving? Well, let's go investigate and find out and quantify it and go, oh, 70%, it's worse than we thought. Now, let's go look at root causes. What do we want to take action on? And then can we get, right, to, the opposite of the problem statement, which is now we're achieving near 100% first pass yield. So doing that VOE planning gives you that check before you go commit resources that we're even on the right path. Did we define the problem correctly? Boy, is that an important step. I could do a whole nother session just on problem definition, because if you don't define the problem correctly, right, you could pursue the wrong pathways. Then, right, does our investigation tell us what we need to know to continue on? Right? If I don't have an understanding of what I'm hoping to uncover in the end, then I might be taking my investigation in the wrong directions. And if my investigation is in the wrong directions, then I'm going to come up with the wrong actions. And then I'm going to try to guess at whether or not we were successful. And then we see all kinds of weird behaviors happen after that. And again, what you're trying to avoid is you don't want somebody trying to fit the outcomes to the goals, right? You should have the goals obtained again, set up ahead of time, and then say, all right, did we achieve that or not? I'm just reading one of the comments here about companies not documenting the VOE plan early. Yeah, that's the thing here. And then we get into the frequency thing again there. And the open CAPA. And I'm going to talk about that on this slide. I believe it's this slide. Yeah, it is this slide. So there are all kinds of excuses, right? When we say, well, why aren't you doing your VOE planning up front, right? And sometimes it's just simple of, oh, I guess we didn't realize it was supposed to be. We must have interpreted the standard incorrectly. But other times we hear these kind of things. Well, effectiveness is difficult. This is something that's really hard to measure. So we weren't quite sure. And we figured we'd learn something as we do take the action, execute to the action plan, and then we'd understand how to measure it. Okay. Again, I'm going to come back to this kind of raises questions about whether you really even understand the problem, right? You can't get around this. Yes, there are things that are hard to measure, some things that are almost impossible to measure, but there's a way. So, there's another great consultant out there, a guy named Tom Gill, that I took some classes from years ago. He's still around, even though he's like in his 90s. You'll see him on LinkedIn, and he still does webinars and things like that. Great guy to get to know. And he was kind of a character, and he always said things like, if you say things like, that can't be measured, then you're essentially declaring yourself as the end-all, be-all expert in that topic. In his view, everything was measurable. You just need to go find it, right? And that shouldn't be an excuse for just, we're just going to jump ahead and hope for the best. Hope is not a strategy, right? We've all heard that one before. So again, right, if you can't think of how to measure it, I'd go back and go, well, wait, did we even define the problem correctly? Did we do a good investigation? Is this really a good definition of actions there? It's just, you're not going to get where you need to get by just going, this is hard to measure, and thinking that's an okay thing to say. So to the point people are making for, right, VOE sometimes can take a long time, right? It could be something done infrequently. We don't make that part very often. I had a situation with a supplier problem. We only bought from the supplier twice a year. So if I wanted a decent number of points, right, to tell me whether or not they were back on the right track, it was going to take me several years to be sure. This is okay. I don't know where this belief that we have to close CAPAs quickly. Well, I kind of know where it comes from because, in some of the standards, you have this comment about that actions need to be completed without undue delay. That's true. The actions you come up with should be, based on the risk, should be reasonably implement it, right? If it's something really high risk, you don't want a plan that's going to take 12 months to complete, right? It's got to be done much sooner than that. But there's no such requirement for the overall CAPA process to say you have to close CAPAs without undue delay. You just need to complete the actions without undue delay, which gets you back into a risk-based approach. What do you mean by undue delay? Well, it depends on the risks, right? So this idea, and I know it's very common, for manager review, I ask, all right, what's your metric for CAPA? And one, it's always how many CAPAs are open, and that's another big discussion of whether that's a good metric. It's not. And how long have they been open for, right? And management freaks out when CAPAs are open for too long.
Or worse yet, Steve, that all CAPAs have to be closed within 6 months.
Right, yeah, setting a hard date, right? And I've seen worse than that. And I've seen limitations on the investigation, limitations on the overall CAPA. I actually saw a place and it was literally, it said all CAPAs have to be closed within 2 weeks. And I went, oh, that's a big discussion right there, right? I mean, basically you're gonna get what can be done in 2 weeks, not what needs to be done. But go ahead.
No, I was going to say when we wrote this part of the standard and put this piece in, I can tell you that, I mean, because the 2003 edition didn't have this undue delay piece in the corrective action area. It was added in the 2016 version of the standard. It came from, believe it or not, the internal audit, because the section on internal audit did have a piece on taking action without undue delay. And the question was, what makes corrective actions different than audit observations that need to be closed? I mean, those are corrective actions, right? You've identified a problem and you're taking some action. So we kind of said for consistency, we needed to add this about undue delay. Now, the second part of it, and you talked about the risk-based thing, but people often ask, well, why didn't you just say, it has to be closed within, a year or whatever like that? Well, we don't know how long it's going to take. There are corrective actions out there that take 5+ years to get them all accomplished in the actions. And that's okay.
Exactly. Yeah. You
It's
certainly want metrics to say, well, how often do we hit the due dates on each individual action, right? To show that you follow the plan and that people actually take CAPA seriously. But yeah, there's no requirement that a CAPA can't be open, the full process can't be open for a long time. I've heard people say, oh, the auditors will ping me for that. No, they won't. It's not in there. So the other thing I should have pointed out in our introductions is Mark just alluded to, Mark is part of the ISO working groups for ISO 9000, 9001, 1345, and 14971. So Mark has great insights into the why was it written this way kind of thing, as he just gave us an example.
Well, and that, again, that undue delay, I mean, when you're writing a plan, you get an opportunity to write your due dates. So if you have 3 extensions past that, now you have to start asking questions about, well, what's causing the delay? Right? Because you said how long it was going to take you. We gave you the opportunity. It's a basic tenet of ISO to come back to, say what you're going to do, and then show that you did what you said you were going to do. What's the delay if that you didn't figure in? And you provide that justification of what the delay is, no problem. Right?
Yep.
It's just
as long as it's not like, oh, we got busy, right? Or I forgot.
Insufficient resources, right?
Yeah. Right. Right. Because you're supposed to have adequate resources, and that's a whole nother requirement, right? But yeah, I mean, and again, I think this is a place where doing VOE planning up front can help you avoid missing those due dates because, oftentimes you go, well, we are going to have to file an extension because we discovered something we hadn't considered before, right? Or the scope suddenly got bigger than we thought. Those sound like better reasons for extensions, but to me, I'm kind of going, well, wait, is that an indictment of your investigation? Because why didn't you find that out? Now, it could truly be this was a very complex issue and we couldn't find it out. I've often talked about I was working at a company and the investigation phase for a CAPA, we had one that had been open for 3 years in investigation because they simply could not make the event happen again. And therefore, they could not figure out what made it happen in the first place. But, and again, it happened. I always tell the story. It happened to occur during an FDA inspection. FDA was on site when the issue happened. So FDA was definitely aware that it had happened. So they had to keep updating FDA. But 3 years later, FDA was still comfortable because they kept saying, we've tried this, didn't lead us where we want to go. So our next plan is to attempt this. And FDA was like, this is what you're supposed to do. You keep at it, you keep progressing. And then eventually, 3 years later, they finally had the aha moment and figured it out. So yeah, there is no requirement for a specific closure of CAPAs or to ever close a CAPA. And I'll talk about that in just a second. That could be really hard to swallow. But again, the individual actions, absolutely get those done without undue delay, hit those dates and measure those, right? What percentage of the time do we hit those dates? But a CAPA can be open a long time because the VOE may take a long time, right? You could have an action plan that you can get done in a couple of weeks, but the VOE, because of the infrequency, is going to take 2-3 years or something like that. There is the general nature of it's hard to prove that something can't ever recur or can't ever occur in the first place if you're doing preventive action. And there's some truth to that, right? How can you be 100% confident? But then again, right, if you do any studying of statistics and sampling and things like that, the goal usually isn't 100%, right? Confidence levels are established at a little lower than that. And that's what you want to do is, can I at least establish confidence? That might require doing that over time, okay? Because maybe we can't ever reach a definitive conclusion, but our VOE is going to become part of our ongoing metrics and monitoring. So we're going to continue to watch it over time. We'll get some initial data that seems to point to, that we're heading in the right direction. 6 months later, we'll have even more confidence, and you'll keep building up that confidence. But there's a possibility that means, well, then the CAPA never closes. Yeah, that's possible. And again, it's not bad. Although what I'd say in that case is I'd go, look, we are going to close the CAPA and we're going to say we've now built our VOE into our normal monitoring and measuring and management review process. So it's now become just part of the standard operating procedure for how we do quality planning and continuous improvement and that kind of thing. And because of that, we're going to consider the CAPA closed because now it's just, again, part of our operations.
The other thing that I'd go on here, Steve, is sometimes it's a different cause, right? And a different sequence of events that result in something that looks very similar.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that you failed the effectiveness. You may have just discovered another cause or a different cause, a different sequence of events that now needs its own corrective action. And so, there may be more to it than that. So just watch out that just because a similar event occurs that you don't just automatically fail effectiveness as you're looking at it. Complete the investigation and determine if there was a different cause.
Yeah, I agree. When I teach root cause analysis, I often talk about that you need to watch for whether there's more than one cause, right? And you're rarely lucky that there's ever just one. There's usually others. The question is, do they all have to happen together or do they act independently? And what you're talking about, Mark, is if you've got independent causes and any one of them could trigger the same problem, yeah, you could have missed that in your initial investigation. And so then it looks as if the VOE fails, but actually you might be able to show that the action or the cause you did address well. It's just that you missed that there was one or two others, and now you need to go back with new action plans to address those. So I think that's a valid point about you want to be careful about declaring victory too quickly. You also want to be careful about declaring defeat too quickly. And then the last piece is just this Oh, do we really have to use validated test methods for this? Do we have to actually pick the right test methods? Yes. Okay. You Um, you need to know is my method for determining VUE going to even produce the valid information? Is right. And again, this comes back to, well, if your investigation didn't produce data, what am I going to compare it to? But the same thing is my test method might produce some sort of information, but at the wrong granularity, the wrong units of measure, or it's just measuring the wrong thing, right? That is really more of a symptom, but not really part of the cause or the sequence of events. So yeah, you need to test the test and go, is this going to tell us what we needed to tell us? There's also the possibility that the method you choose influences the results. I know I see a lot of it, right? Where the VUE is, well, we're gonna watch the next three builds of that item, right? Well, right, there's some bias that you could be creating there. The fact that people are aware they're being observed could make them do it perfectly, or the fact that they're being observed makes them nervous, and now they mess up, right? Neither one of those is telling you the right thing about whether or not the process is improved or now working to remove that cause and address it correctly. So you got to be careful about. There's also things that just burden that you're gonna add an inspection step or a test in there somewhere, and does that distract the operators, or does it slow down the process, or impact certain things like curing times or something that now have to be reconsidered? So again, there's lots of ways in which the method you choose for doing VUE can actually change the results of what you're looking at. And then at the end of the day, we're talking a lot about data, about having good data, good information at least, to base everything on. The way in which you use that data, right, has to be scientifically and statistically sound. If you're a fan of reading warning letters, right, it's very common to see FDA ping facilities um, for not using scientifically sound methods for what they're doing. They made an assumption, this sounded good, and we do it. And I think that happens a lot in VUE planning as well. This sounds like the right way to look at this. Or, we gathered this data, we put it in a spreadsheet, and we have smart engineers, and they looked at it and said, yeah, this makes sense. If you've never sat down and talked with a statistician, it's a good thing to do. There's a reason they exist. They are wired differently than the rest of us, and you will learn stuff from them that you had not considered when it comes to how do you handle data. And again, this would be a risk-based decision, right? So if it's a high risk, incident that you're trying to address here, and you've got all this very complex data, I wouldn't be a hobbyist on this. I'd go get some expert help, from somebody who knows, statistics, really well to say this is the right way to look at this data, and now here's what it's telling you. Otherwise, you can convince yourself of all kinds of neat things by manipulating the data.
So Steve, what do you think about, hey, I'm just going to wait for the next 3 months to see if we're going to get any more complaints? Is that a good verification of effectiveness?
Yeah, all this passive stuff, right? I mean, that essentially is luck, right? You're counting on that nobody thinks to complain or they didn't know it, right? Sometimes things can be subtle and they just didn't notice the failure, right? Or didn't understand the nature of it and that it was related to your product or, whatever. So yeah, luck is not a very good VOE strategy, and being passive is not the way to go. You need to, right? If you took if this qualified to be a CAPA, right, and all the formality that goes with that, and you took the time to put the resources on there, now at the end is not the time to suddenly back off of those resources and say, here again, hope is a strategy here or luck is a strategy. I'd want to know. Right, if I'm in management, I'd want to know, well, what did I just have all those resources do that were not directly related to producing new product, right? Which to me sounds like, well, it's cost of poor quality, it's waste. I shouldn't have had to do it. I'd want to know, did that deliver anything for the money I just spent on it? So yeah, those kind of passive approaches are not really a good way to go.
I'll tell you, Steve, that one of my favorite kind of effectiveness checks, and some things I've implemented with a few clients. If anybody knows who Wayne Taylor is, You talked about statisticians that talk in a different way. Wayne Taylor's and his change point analysis um, helps you understand that you made some change and it made a difference, right? That sounds a lot like verification of effectiveness. I want to know that what I did made a actual change. So change point analysis is one of those things that you want to look up.
Good recommendation there. So, all right. So I don't know. I don't know how many of you have run into these kind of excuses. I've run into them in a lot of different places and different forms. Um, you need to recognize them and you need to push back against them and go, that isn't really going to take us where we want to go here. All right, so let's kind of wrap things up here.
Yeah, before we go into this, Steve, I just want you to address one of the comments that came in on the chat.
Okay.
And Ashley Ann had asked about the CAPA process, and so if many organizations in the supply chain are 9001, not 1345, and don't have to technically meet the regulation. So what if they don't have a process called CAPA? 9001 doesn't have preventive action in it, so they don't necessarily have an SOP or process that's called CAPA. They do have a non-conforming process. They do have corrective action request process. Is that good enough?
Well, I think it is, as long as you build kind of the layers of this, right? Um, in FDA, coined the term death by kappa, right? That wasn't really the intent, was to use kappa to capture all non-conformances. So, each process in your quality system should have some element of non-conformance management built into it, right? How do we deal with things that are not what we expected them to be? And then there's kind of, do you have criteria for when to escalate it? Is it a one-off, or is this indicative of something more systemic? That's within the process. Do you have metrics that allow you to see that across processes? Because it could be you've got one-offs in different processes, but they all essentially are the same type of problem, which now indicates it's systemic across processes. And then that tells you, okay, then I need my, that formal layer of, it isn't just something we can deal with through corrections or small corrective actions with lowercase letters. Now, when do we go formal, capitalized corrective action? Um, uh, and I think, you need to just have that. It's a process, it's a system, right? We've talked about the process approach, that these aren't just individual activities. They do need to have connections. Whatever you want to call them anything you want to call them. I know companies use the terms deviations, variances. Fine, as long as you're getting the semblance of you're trying to solve systemic problems so that they can't happen again, right? Or finding things that could go wrong that haven't yet, but you don't want to get there.
And I think you just said some of the key pieces there, Steve, is that whether we've called it a corrective action or called it a preventive action, go back to that definition. I think because lots of times I'll call it risk management even. But the definition of corrective action, right, was actions taken to prevent recurrence. It didn't matter that I called it a nonconformance or a deviation or corrective action or whatever, but I'm taking some action to prevent recurrence. That is the definition of corrective action, if they called it that or not. And whether you called it that or not, it still meets these requirements because the standard didn't necessarily say you have to call it a corrective action and then verification of effectiveness and all that kind of stuff apply. It says when you do corrective action, you have to do this stuff. So
yeah, I think that's a good point.
It didn't say that only for those things that you call corrective action do you have to do verification of effectiveness. No, it says when you take action to prevent recurrence.
Yeah.
When you take action to prevent occurrence, you
Yeah.
have to do this stuff.
Right. And then I'll go back to, me, I like to be heretical every once in a while, and I'll say things like, forget there's an FDA, forget there's an ISO. You want to run your business well, you don't want problems, right? You want to make the most profits. Why would you not want to know whether or not the actions you just spent money on produce the right effect and are going to guarantee you value going forward? Just look fine. Just look at it from as a greedy business person. Just do it from that perspective. This is what you want to know. Did my money provide value?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, now turns out there's some standards that guide you on how to do that. If you're in the regulated space, then yes, there's like regulated bodies like the FDA. They're going to tell you have to do it, but forget they exist. And then just go to if I want to run my business correctly, don't I want to know this? I would. I'm a business owner, Mark, and for the owners, I want to know that our money that we spend produces good results. I would think everybody else would want that as well.
And you understand where the regulations and the standard requirements come from, right? Because somebody else did it wrong and failed.
Right.
And so
Yeah,
we're writing requirements so that you don't have that problem.
right. It's yeah. You need to look at it from that perspective. The reason it's there is not because ISO or FDA or any other body thought it was funny to make you jump through a hoop. It's because somebody did this, right? You know, if anybody has looked at uh, the IFU for your lawnmower and noticed that there's a warning about picking it up and using it as a hedge trimmer, right? And for most of us, I think you'd go, well, why would I ever think to do that? Well, because somebody did, right? So now they have to say it.
So I'll come back and ask Russ and others, did we answer your question on that verification of effectiveness and that, that it stays open for some time?
Yeah, yeah, I think yeah, there were good examples. So I think it's just one of those where things, you have a problem and then it's infrequent. You just got to plan for that timeline, in terms of, when's the data. And I think the other good tip in there is what are the acceptance criteria and the endpoints. I think that's an important message to give.
And I will tell you, Russ, the suggestion I just gave you about Wayne Taylor's change point analysis, even for those things that happen very infrequently, his change point analysis works.
Yeah, I'm going to read up on that. Thank you.
I see Alex asked an interesting question in the chat, so I think I'll jump on this before I wrap up with the key takeaways here. Because I alluded to, what I thought were bad CAPA metrics, and he asked, okay, so what would be the good ones? Again, I think measuring on-time completion of individual actions across all of your CAPAs tells you, does the organization really pay the right amount of attention to this? I worked at a place and I came in and only 20% of actions were being completed on time. Okay. That's going to look really bad to an auditor, but it just tells me we don't care. And therefore, we're not making improvements to our quality system. We need to, fix that. And that means management's not paying attention either, is what it told me. Nobody was really putting a thumb on people going, hey, if you take on or get assigned an action as part of a CAPA plan, you have to get it done, right? And if you can't, then you need to communicate why you can't and what resources you need because it's management's responsibility to provide adequate resources, right? So I usually go for that one first. I like maybe percentage of CAPAs that end in successful VOE. Right? I kind of want to know how often do my VOEs fail because that might tell me about my VOE planning.
What I want to say, sometimes though too, is that be careful how you phrase that. I mean, you can't just give yourself 10 years to do something just because you don't want to be late, right? You have to put some reasonableness to it.
Yeah.
This is why we have things like CAPA board and the people reviewing what due dates are, and you have to submit a plan and an acceptance. All of these things are ways to make sure that they're being managed appropriately, but not too tight or way too loose.
Yeah, again, it's risk based, and there's that undue delay thing, right? If you can get it done in 2 weeks, get it done in 2 weeks. Don't say, "Oh, we're going to take 6 months to do that." Where you'll definitely, I mean, again, like I said, don't worry about pretend there's no FDA or ISO, but at some point they have teeth, right? And you do need to pay attention to it. And uh, I saw a warning letter a couple of months back from a company and they had apparently had a long list of inspectional observations by FDA. They responded to all of them, but you could kind of read between the lines that FDA was annoyed by how long the plan was going to be. That the FDA was just sort of shaking its head, going, No, and that's why they got the warning letters, because basically said your responses are inadequate because, without saying it, the amount of time you want is ridiculous, right? You should be able to do something in the interim at least, or progress through some steps. So there are ways you could get bitten by over, over padding the estimates, kind of thing. Just another last thing about kappa metrics. I know the most common one is like how many kappas are open. Um, it isn't necessarily a bad metric in and of itself. I probably want to know, right? Is there a sudden increase in the number of kappas, particularly by area of the quality system or by department or something like that? The key there is that to me is more of a monitoring. I'm not going to set a goal because I always ask the question, if you had 0 kappas this month, is that good or bad? Maybe you had a great month and things didn't go wrong, but I'm always going to go, look, I know the nature of my quality system and the nature of my company. Does that make sense to me that there were no problems? Right? Maybe one month you go, yeah, that happens, right? Every once in a while, whatever. But I was auditing a place and I went in and they had a really nicely defined kappa process. And then I said, all right, let me see your kappa log. And they said, well, we don't have one. I said, why don't you have one? Why we didn't have any kappas. And I went, what, this year? And they went, well, ever. I went, when did you establish the process? 3 years ago. I was like, oh, okay. There's some big problems here, right? But in manager review, they were reporting this metric of 0 kappas, and they were really proud of that. It's like, no, you're just not recognizing, right? There's that requirement that you have to be able to find, things to take action on, and that's what it indicated. And actually, you see that a lot in FDA warning letters where people have really well-defined kappa processes, but nothing feeds it, right? They're failing to do the data analysis on their quality system and not feeding it. So yeah, do I want to know how many kappas are open so I can watch for any sudden spikes that might be alarming? Yeah, but I don't know if I want to set a goal of 0.
Yeah, and I'll go another spot too, because I mean, lots in the past, and many people again are familiar with the fact that this exemption on records availability for management review is going away with the 2000 or with the QMSR, and people are upset about that because lots of times that's where they would put their action items, was put them in management review and didn't open a kappa, and that's a no-no. They should go through that corrective action process and get the rest of it. Again, just because you took the action to prevent recurrence somewhere else doesn't mean it's not kappa.
All right, let's wrap up here in the last 5 minutes. So again, right? Remember, VOE is not the same as completion verification. You do have to verify that you completed the actions as defined, right? So that is an important thing to watch is completion, but that's not the same as VOE. So when I see VOEs that they say, "Oh, verification effectiveness, we have a training attendance list." That doesn't tell me it was effective. It just tells me that one of your actions was retraining, and the attendance list tells me that you completed it. Doesn't tell me it worked. Again, I hope the gist of this you got was right. It's action planning for the entire process. VOE needs to be part of that right from the start. It's not a separate piece you do later. As I said, the value of that can be that it can create this great test of whether you've even got a good investigation to work from and whether you've picked the right actions. If you think about, right, again, how am I going to measure this? If I can't answer that question, either I haven't really defined the action well, or maybe I didn't perform the investigation well and I didn't put it on this bullet, or maybe I didn't even define the problem well, right? So it does serve as a really good check and balance. Um, and then, yeah, that's going to create confidence. Again, if you're going to disrupt your organization to work on things they didn't normally have to work on as part of a kappa, then I want to be confident that this is going to lead to success, especially management's going to want to know, how do we know this is going to work, right? Before we go spend this money that we shouldn't have had to spend, right? So it just gives you that check that, yeah, we feel good about this. We are sure. We're not guessing. We're pretty sure that this is going to work well.
And again, a big part of any of these quality management system processes, and CAPA being one of the main ones, is that it has to bring value to your organization. Completing this verification shows that you've brought the value to the organization, shows that the actions that you've taken are effective in preventing the recurrence of problems or preventing the occurrence of issues. So that's what the value is here, um, to verify that your
Yeah,
business.
if you want to make the quality organization look good, right? It's show that you have an impact on the bottom line. Think back to the example I gave about the first pass yield, right? That 70% first pass yield means there was 30% failing products, which had a scrap value. I actually took that from a real example, and the numbers were far worse than that. There's a dollar value in there, right? That we were able to show we were scrapping X thousands or tens of thousands of dollars per year. And now we've identified this, we've taken the time to correctly investigate, plan, and now we can prove at 99.999% all of that loss, right, in dollars for scrap went away, right? That's tens of thousands of dollars per year we now have that we wouldn't have had. That's going to help people understand why is quality as an organization or as a function important to the company. All right, we are pretty much to the end, but are there any follow-on questions? We can hang on for a few more minutes. All right, we got Mark Wheeler. Do you recommend implementing regular updates to CAPA reports, i.e. status updates in different phases for long-term open CAPAs that may take a long time to close? Yeah, I think just in general, there should be, um, you know, again, if CAPA is an important process.
Yeah. And
Uh,
and and for sure, I mean, CAPAs are basically projects, right? In basic project management, to keep a project on track, you have regular update meetings,
Great
right?
example.
Even if it's just a 5 minute update or whatever, but you have those regular update meetings to make sure that they stay on track, right? You don't want to get to the day that it's due and say, "Oh, we need to extend it." No, no. You should have had updates going along the way
Yeah.
saying, what the status is and whether or not they need an extension. That's why that's what it's really frustrating when you get to that due date and somebody says, "Oh, I need to extend that." No, no, you're late. Okay, now explain to management why you're late.
Thank you, Stephen Mark. Yeah, I've seen that personally with long-term CAPAs that are open for various reasons, and just because so many things can change within that time period, or more importantly, some people might leave their position and new people come in, and you know
Yep.
the and you need to just make sure that they're brought on board, or just keeping updates on that, and then and somebody can come in, an auditor can say, well, okay, this thing is open for 3 years, this CAPA report, what have you done with it? Well, we're waiting for the data points to be gathered. Yeah, but what have you really? Okay, when was the last time you talked about this? And then at least if you have an update, at least you can show that it's been checked in on a regular
Yeah.
basis.
Yeah, you raise a really interesting, scenario, right? Where somebody changes position, somebody leaves, somebody else comes in, and then part of your onboarding process now you can figure out, does that account for letting the new person know, by the way, your department or you have specific responsibility for some actions, right, that are being observed. Because I've seen that happen where we watch the metric for how often actions are being completed on time, and then you try to figure out, well, why, right? We put reason codes on them. And I've seen that where it's like, oh, because there was a change in personnel. And that tells me, like, all right, well, that means there's a problem with our onboarding process or our, not just our onboarding, but even our personnel management processes where we're leaving out this piece of information about what exactly is this person going to be responsible for rather than just what's in their job description.
Again, I come back to, some of the basic project management type skills that we would use.
Yeah.
You don't make something due the first week of the month, right? You make it due the last week of the month, because if I think it's due on July 7th, well, I have July to get it done, right? No, no, no. Why not actually put your due date in the right spot? Look for holidays. I mean, sometimes people will just, at the end of the month, the 30th or 31st. That's a Saturday. Would you have something to do on a Saturday? All of these types of things in basic project management. It's the same thing, when you have project management and project resources change, you do an evaluation of what's the impact on the project, right? Come back and use those basic project management skills as you do these things as well.
Ashley Ann added that she likes to have a timeline and justification of extensions. Yeah, I mean your CAPA process, or a lot of your processes, right, should have that with if there's a plan, how do you manage changes to that plan and requests for extension? What are the acceptable reasons for it? Mark alluded to, you can't ask for an extension after the due date, right? Kind of thing. You need to ask in advance. And I've seen other places where there's kind of an escalation. Your first in CAPA, your first request for extension just goes to the CAPA board.
This is a key spot to get that risk-based thinking in there, risk-based
Yeah.
approach. What is the risk if I extend this? There's an additional risk that I have another occurrence or recurrence. Hey, what's my risk of that? If I extend it by a month or 2 months.
Yeah, there's those kind of questions because you want to have you want to have time to review. Wait, no, you can't extend that. If we need more resources to get it done on time, then we need to bubble that up, kind of thing. But what I was also going to say is there's sort of the shaming approach. Like I said, first request you could get through the CAPA board. If you wanted to go to the second, if you wanted to do a second extension request, then you had to talk to the director of quality for that. And and your manager had to be there, and the third one had to go to the VP, the highest VP at the facility, where you were going to have to explain to the VP why you weren't getting it done. And then the other place I work where I said, hey, I got there and only 20% of actions are being completed on time. The CEO was very supportive, but what he said was fine. In management review, which we were doing quarterly, he says, I want to see names now. I want you to put up the status of each CAPA, and I want in red if they have actions overdue, and I want to have the name up there. People will quickly figure out they don't want their name in that presentation.
With that, Steve, we're a little bit over time.
Yep.
Just want to make sure that you get a chance to ask any questions. You got our email there, the contact. If you go to the website, Steve and I's picture are on there. You can click on our picture and get our email directly, or you can call us through our 833 number.
Yep.
So,
and LinkedIn, connect with us, connect with the company, and we love to get messages and continue the talk.
And you can always come back to the YouTube channel through our website as well to be able to rewatch it if you have any questions.
Thanks again. Appreciate everybody's time, and we hope to see you at the next one.
Yeah. Good luck, everybody.
Thanks, Steve and Mark. Very helpful.
Yep.
Yep.
Right.